Welcome, everyone, to the Herbert C. Kelman seminar on international conflict. And as most of you probably know, this is co-sponsored by the Program on Negotiation and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs here at Harvard. And we are thrilled that you've joined us. I know people are here from all over the world, and thank you for spending time with us. Especially this is such a fascinating talk that our colleague and friend Sarah Federman is giving. So hold on to your seats. It's going to be a good one. And I also just wanted to explain the format. What we'll do is Sarah will be given about 35 minutes, however long she takes to present her ideas about her new book. And then we will open it up to you for a Q&A. And please put your questions in the Q&A function, because what I'll do is after Sarah finishes her presentation, I will get on and moderate the questions. I'll deliver them to her and she can, answer them one by one. And what else? Oh, we are also recording this session. So if you'd like to see it again, or if you would want to refer it to a friend, you can just tell them to go on the Program on Negotiation website and click on events, and it'll be there in probably 2 or 3 days. So meanwhile, I've mentioned our friend, Professor Sarah Federman. She's an associate professor of conflict resolution at the Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego. And the title of her talk, as you know, is Corporate Reckoning: How Businesses Can Address Historical Wrongs. And let me just give you a little information about Sarah. She's an associate professor of conflict resolution at the University of San Diego's Kroc Center, as I said, for Peace Studies. She's the author of the award-winning books Transformative Negotiation and The Last Train to Auschwitz, as well as two co-authored anthologies, Introduction to Conflict Resolution and Narratives of Mass Atrocity. Her latest book is Corporate Reckoning, published by MIT Press on April 21st of this year, 2026. In addition to her literary works, in 2022, Sarah testified before Congress concerning the responsibility of U.S. banks to respond to their slavery ties. And Sarah's TED Talk on this topic has been selected by TED's main conference for wider promotion. And we're going to put that link to her TED Talk in the chat function. So, and I think there's a couple of other documents that Sarah's also going to put in there too. So meanwhile, I'm going to disappear. And Sarah, it's yours. Please, thank you again for joining us with this. And it's very exciting. I can't wait to hear your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Donna, for sure, your dignity work has absolutely infused sort of how I come at this work that brings together transitional justice, restorative justice, law. We really need everybody in this. But I think an underpinning of dignity is always important because it's the fabric that keeps the conversation going.
Yeah.
Helps us hold on to our humanity. So your work continues to inform in many ways. So
Well, you're my dignity sister after all. So, yeah. All right. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, I'll be back when you're finished. Okay.
yeah. No, we really do learn together. And Dan Shapiro, who works with PON, has also been really supportive of my efforts in this area for a while. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes. This was a really, in a weird way to say, fun book to write because it wasn't as much about genocide in the details of it as some of my other work. But also because I direct it to executives. So even though it isn't just for executives, I got to make my audience a bit more the larger public or people who work in companies that might have difficult histories. So I got to be a little cheekier. I got to be a little sarcastic sometimes. And that was fun as a New Yorker to bring that voice back after doing a lot of the academic work in the background. So all the citations are shoved in the back in the notes, and the book just sort of reads through quickly. So All right. I want to talk a little bit about how I got here. I was asking Donna whether, well, do I share this story? It is in the preface, but um, it really starts with um, my in the 1980s, my father took a lot of business trips to South Africa. He had a company and he would bring home these stickers. This is actually one of them. And I actually still kept them. I didn't realize this until he died in 2017. And I dug through my sticker collection and I was like, oh my gosh, I actually have these. And it still gave me a little thrill. And it reminded me of what it was like when he would go to South Africa in those days. I mean, it felt further away. Anyone who remembers those days, like you would get calls from abroad that were staticky and super expensive. And he would come back with little trinkets that made me feel like I was connected to this different world. And at a fairly young age, I don't remember how young I was, my mother handed me the book Kaffir Boy, which is about Mark Mathbane's life under apartheid. And so I'm, getting these stickers and these little toys and sort of reading about apartheid and thinking, okay, like I didn't know how to bring them together in my mind. But in that time period, Congress passed a law that no US businesses could do business with South Africa until apartheid ended. So the law happened. I didn't really understand that. I was a kid, but my dad's business trips kept continuing. They kept going. And it didn't really occur to me that disjuncture until I took a class in high school where they taught us about South Africa. And I asked my father, like, well, how did you do that? Like, how were you doing business trips to South Africa and running your company if there was a laws against apartheid, working with South Africa? And he said, oh, I just worked through my London office, so it wasn't illegal. And I was like, well, okay, it wasn't illegal, but like, how do you feel about it? Like, how did you feel about the fact that, and I asked him this years later, like, how do you feel about it? He's like, well, we're really for Mandela and we're for the end of apartheid, but like we hire black people and so like, and we're good to them. So like he didn't really seem to see the discomfort there, but it really bothered me. And I had a really strong sense that the reason I lived in a nice town and didn't have to pay for college because he could pay for it was because of the South Africa monopoly that he had during those years, because no US competitors could be there. So, like, our finances improved during apartheid and then shifted. He did okay afterwards, but like it did shift. So, I say this because I have some, like I inherited some of that opportunity that came from this. I was in South Africa. I joined him on a business trip when I was in high school, and it was a week before Mandela's election. And this is just the lines of people to vote. And I put this up because I hope we see similar lines in our country as well. But just look at that dedication of people really excited for that election. So again, this sort of was in my family in the background, but then I just didn't know what to do with it, right? Life goes on. You have this uncomfortable feeling. And I ended up in the family business for about a decade, traveling all over the world, working with major companies. And that kept going. But then I started to get like another kind of ethical inclination, but not so much about the company that I was working for, because my father wasn't like a shrewd businessman or doing dirty deals or exploiting people in particular ways. But, except for that major South Africa flaw, at least as far as I know. But I did get sent to Paris, where I was overseeing the French office, or a transition of a French office. And I stumbled in the Marais, which is the Jewish quarter, or was the Jewish quarter of Paris. And I saw my own name on a Holocaust memorial wall. And this just like hit me on my heels. And it reminded me of something from my undergrad professor. I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I studied intellectual history. But when he knew I was going to France, we had stayed in touch. It's always good to stay in touch with your professors. But he said, when you get to Paris, find out if the train drivers kept their job after the war. And he meant, what happened to the people who drove all those deportation trains during the Holocaust? Like at the end of the war, did they just keep their jobs? They took all these people to their death. And I said, sure, I'll figure that out for you when I get to Paris. But I had forgotten about his question until I saw my name. And then I was like, oh my God, I actually would have been on that train. And I actually have a picture of that Sarah Fetterman in my office that I found through her niece, actually, because only her brother survived. But that really got me thinking about this question of what are the accountability of the corporations that participate? So there were national railways all around Europe that participated in the Holocaust. And the Holocaust could not have happened without the participation of the railways. And this is what's so interesting, that once I did this research and I took this deep dive into the French national railways, I saw, oh my God, if they had said no, it just wouldn't have happened. Or if the US had bombed the tracks, of course, that would have been very helpful. But that took me in that direction, really looking at the SNCF. So any of you who have been to France, I presume you've been on the SNCF. In terms of trains, it's a great train company. And Holocaust victims came back to them in about the 90s, well, after the Cold War, like many Holocaust restitution, and demanded reparations for pushing them on these trains. They didn't buy a ticket, they didn't ask to go, and they were forced against their will. And most of the 75,000 people transported were murdered. Many more in the Netherlands that transported theirs, the Hungarian rails as well. But I focused on France and I looked at how it was really a 10-year study talking to Holocaust survivors and lobbyists and lawyers and SNCF executives and Jewish leaders to really try to understand the reckoning that went on. That included all various natures of reckoning, because the company refused to pay for a long time. France eventually paid, but they did commemoration, they apologized, they opened their archives, they did all these things that we talk about in transitional justice. So it got me thinking, how can companies atone? How can people atone? But I went to grad school to learn more about this. So I kind of left my business career and I ended up studying mass atrocities and what causes them, how to prevent them, how to help countries and people in the aftermath. And what I learned studying different genocides in my grad program is that the focus was really in my social sciences on the laws at the time, the economics, the big leaders, the political leaders, the victims, then the actual people who did the killing. So we don't even have we have East Timor on here, but we don't even have the Indonesian genocide on this map. But in 1965, there was a genocide there, and it focuses on like who actually did the killing and the victims. But it never talked about the role of businesses. And I had just come from this like childhood that was in a business family and then a decade running all around the planet working with businesses. And I thought that was a really weird disjuncture, especially since I saw how much the French railways was necessary for France's participation in the Holocaust. Then when I was teaching in Baltimore, the students were really pushing me there about, well, what about slavery? What about all the corporate participation in slavery as well? And, I learned about laws and you learn about, you go to the African American History Museum in DC and you learn about the shipping and you learn about how it affected people, but you don't hear as much about the banks that were behind it and a lot of the companies that were necessary to make it all happen, right? So the sugar trade, coffee, tobacco, and so on. But there's legacies of that today, but there's a lot of focus still on national reparations. It required financing. Banking wasn't actually big enough in the early 1800s, late 1700s to actually make plantation agriculture possible. Even though they were using free labor, they needed huge amounts of cash. And banking completely transformed into more of what we know today to fund plantation agriculture. So those histories are all and those banking brands that have trusted heritage, most of them go back to plantation agriculture, either through cotton, tobacco, and or sugar. So my takeaway from my different research into both slavery, which is why I ended up testifying in Congress on the role of the banks, and the Holocaust, looking specifically at the train companies, and then expanding beyond, starting to look at other atrocities. I realized that actually you can't have any mass atrocity without human participation. So mass atrocity means human inflicted, right? So it's not like a flood, although now more of those are about our behavior with the planet, our interaction with the planet. So I'm looking now at, okay, corporations are necessary for mass atrocities, which include ecocides as well as genocides and mass murder and mass poisoning, whether that's healthcare, whether that's the Sacklers, right, with opioids, Purdue Pharma, but you do need companies. And so if that's true, well, then they need to atone too. And what do we need to do in order to help them make better choices? Because I don't, at least no business students I've met have said that they're going into business to create mass atrocity and to destroy the environment and kill people, right? It's like it's something that ends up happening, but it is not their intent. So it's really important to have these conversations, which is why I'm doing this work today. Why this matters so much, even is corporations we know this, but I think that the data is sometimes helpful. Like, so corporations are so surpassing transnational corporations, countries in size, that now Exxon is bigger than 176 countries when you compare revenue to GDP. Okay, so Exxon, just like Walmart is much bigger than Peru. So when you start to understand the size of these companies and that they have been lobbying, especially those in the US have effectively done so, they lobby for rights, right? They got corporate personhood, but they got personhood for rights. You don't lobby for obligations, right? So who's going to lobby for corporate obligations? And any politician who's got all this need to raise money, right, to get reelected gets in with these corporations. And so they don't want to challenge them either. So there's been all of this sort of getting together with these corporations, giving them rights, reducing their obligations. And I had said influencing diplomacy, but in some cases they control diplomacy or have taken over diplomacy. And they're involved in all stages of conflict. So I think this is a really important time for those, like I'm in a school for peace and justice, for us to just make really visible like corporations have always been a part of these atrocities, and they can continue to be today, but they can also be agents of freedom and peace and sustainability, and they can do other things. And it's not just me that's saying this. What was really interesting to learn as I was writing this book is that South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so some of you may be very familiar with this, that after apartheid, South Africa said, okay, what are we going to do? We can't just move forward, like, and just be like, okay, apartheid's over, let's go. They decided to actually do a lot of transition work. And that's Desmond Tutu, right, who Donna Hicks worked with for many years. And Donna was very involved and can tell us more about this and maybe in the Q&A. But one of the things I learned in doing research is of the 2.5 years or so that this commission went on, where people talked about the harm, and then the people who did the harm had to listen and talk about the harm they did in exchange for amnesty, there were 3 days dedicated to the role of businesses and the role businesses played in upholding apartheid. And this, of course, to me meant a big deal, meant a lot, because this was the question I was having conversation I was having with my father. And the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, said yes, business was central to the economy that sustained South African states during the apartheid years. They went on to name certain sectors, certain companies, and encourage them to be part of undoing the harm, right? They didn't have teeth. They were a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They couldn't make them do anything. But they did start to expose that role and say that, you know what, you can't really keep a regime of oppression going without corporate help. And others are starting to make this more visible as well. So Lee Payne and her team at Oxford University are showing which Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world are actually talking about businesses and the role of businesses. So it exposes them. Michael Kelly wrote a book that's a number of years old now, but on prosecuting corporations for genocide. And we're seeing some of these cases come up where there are trials that are starting to hold corporations accountable, or and even actually individual executives. So there's a growing conversation in genocide studies. Just this morning, I'm so excited. I found an article by Yukiko Koga, who's writing about post-imperial reckoning. So corporate transitional justice in the unmaking of the Japanese Empire. So looking at Chinese slave labor during World War II. So it's not just in the West, like it is happening all over the world. Lee Payne's group looks a lot at South America, where this is made really visible. So just to give you a sense of specific companies. So Brown Brothers Harriman, some of you may know, BBH. So there have been articles about them. They were actually sued. The plaintiffs didn't win because the court said that the plaintiffs could not demonstrate that they had been personally harmed by the bank's links to slavery. They also challenged Aetna and some others. But there was this big period where a number of companies were being exposed and apologizing, making statements, studying their history. You may have remembered this. It may feel like a long time ago right now, but it was only about 5, 6 years ago, right? So even though this is sort of a moment that I'm speaking to you is quite different than the moment in which I started this work or the years in which I was doing it, it does ebb and flow. Like these pasts don't go away. They do come back, and sort of how we reckon with them or not depends how we're going to weather the next era. Brooks Brothers is just more of a creepy history, which is they close slaves, and so they can make yourself look like a nice slave owner by getting them beautiful Brooks Brothers clothing. Um, so it's sort of a creepy history. But there were apologies. And so I talk about in the book, I give different examples of companies that are trying to atone. Maybe they've been sued and that's why they're atoning. Maybe they just decided they want to do do this work. And there's still railroad lawsuits about the Holocaust. Like it just doesn't quite end, right? Because there's the Hungarian Railway, the Dutch. The French one was much bigger in the United States because the SNCF is such a strong rail company, it bids for contracts here. So they bid for contracts in Florida, like dreaming we're going to get high-speed rail someday. Because our Acela train from Boston and to New York and DC is not really a high-speed train. It's just faster than we're used to, but it's still like not quite that. But SNCF, it does bid for contracts here, and it ran into its Holocaust history in the US. There were a number of people who boycotted it and made it very hard for them to win contracts. So this still goes on, right? So beyond paying for the invoice, how else can corporations respond to historical wrongs? So we think about accountability, especially we're in a you know, a culture dominated by legalism, one that pushes for money as an idea of accountability. And that's just a piece of it. And the reason I want to we can talk about the paying and the different lawsuits and sort of corporate impunity and where it is and where it isn't, because it is shifting and you can't rely on your impunity. There's a lot else that goes on when we talk about historical wrongs. Uh, Transitional justice, for those of you who are familiar with the concept, is this idea of transitioning a country, is where it started, from an autocratic one to a democratic one, and sort of how do you help them transition after that. But it has grown to mean sort of post-atrocity work. What do you do after an atrocity? Well, you need to have some transparency. Compensate the harmed, some apologies need to be made, commemoration, because what you're trying to do, there's some more here too, trials, victim services, institutional reform, looking at some gender justice, depending on how different groups were affected by the violence. There's this idea that if you just pay somebody, like, okay, so we harmed you, here's a check. It's not quite the full healing needed to help a society live together. And when it's been mass atrocity, you just can't put everybody in jail. Right? So many people participate in these harms. You can't just incarcerate them all. So we're left with what do we do? And transitional justice and people in this reconciliation work have been asking these questions. And they're really important questions. And it's difficult to do this work well. I was just talking to CJ, who organizes your events, about an event that she was at where they're talking about Greensboro, North Carolina. There was a sort of a post-reconciliation Truth Commission there, the Wabanaki Truth Commission in Maine, which had to do with how Indigenous kids were ripped from their families. So these are being used all over the country, in the United States too, related to slavery and hangings. In Maryland, they're doing one. And we can think about them with corporations. And so what I've done, so not the most I didn't invent AI. All I did was say, how do we take transitional justice and think about how it could apply to corporations? Because they're looking at sort of what's the cost of this to us, financially and maybe to their brand. But I'm saying, no, you want to do what actually countries have to do. And all this is saying is you want to do an independent study, you want to revise your materials. You got to make a statement, you got to engage with descendants and make meaningful responses. And you have to reform the corporate ethos. I have a section in the book on companies that just keep finding themselves in trouble. Like companies that were part of the Holocaust were part of apartheid, and then they go on to do other things. Or they're part of slavery and the Holocaust and apartheid. And if they don't reform the corporate ethos, they're just at it again. So If you want to look at IG Farben, which was part of the Holocaust as well, and the Zyklon B gas, there's a big Supreme Court case right now having to do with Bayer, which is IG Farben, and Roundup, that spray, and whether or not it causes cancer. And they're sort of fighting so actually non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They're trying to get exemption from having to curtail that product, even though it seems to make people quite sick. So some of these same companies keep repeating, and that's what I'm really focused on. It's not just enough to pay the bill, you've got to change. And there's a lot of organizations that are part of this, that are doing this. So I want to say it's not just a few. So yes, universities like Harvard and Yale and Georgetown and Brown University have been leaders in this. There's a group called Universities Studying Slavery that looks at their histories. Now, we shouldn't be so surprised that universities engage in this work. They have a commitment to knowledge and truth. Same with The Guardian and the Baltimore Sun, which are newspapers, right? Of course, newspapers want to be part of transparency and they have to have your faith in them. And so they do this work as well. But we're also seeing banks do it. And I just worked with Heaven Hill, which is a bourbon brand, who was looking at their history and really sort of thinking about how to engage with that. So there are more than this. The book has lots of examples all over the world, and I'm advocating that we actually, those who are doing it, we encourage them to keep doing it or help them do it better rather than just yell at them when they do it wrong or we think they do it wrong. But it's difficult work because the harm is irreparable in many ways, but the benefits that they can give are tremendous. It starts with, and I'm such a history nerd. I love this. Independent study of the past. You can't study your own past. If I were to write a history of my life, it would not be the same as if someone else were to write a history of our lives, right? So we have to go beyond hagiographies or house histories, what companies write about themselves. Even journalists who write about companies, it's really hard because you start to fall in love with the company you study, but you need to have a real independent, sharp eye looking for the harm. Because what happens is if you don't do that, you miss it. When I was doing this bourbon research, it's interesting because you don't get to hear about the impact of slavery on those in Kentucky because they're not written about. I mean, I actually laughed at the end of the research. I thought, I'm not even sure women existed in the late 1700s. Like, they're just not talked about. So there's this idea that if you don't go in and really look for sort of what the footprint is of the company beyond company records, you can't actually get a good view. So in the book, I talk about how do you actually do a really good business history. And that means going beyond sort of the archives. But the archives is where you've got to see this. There are some fascinating things in the archives. I've been digging through them and learning quite a bit about our history. And that's what both Harvard and Yale have done. Yale's, I think, came out more recently, but they went through and actually was like, all right, this is our connection. One thing that worked really well for Yale is that they were releasing their findings as they were finding them. So I talked to David Blight, who wrote Yale and Slavery, and engaged with the New Haven legacy community to say, okay, this is what we just found. How can we build a program that responds to this harm, rather than just delivering the book and then trying to create a plan. So I just wanted to throw a little nugget because some of you might be researchers. And if you are, there is a huge amount of information at the Library of Congress. So Alexander Brown and Sons is it's the business that created investment banking. They came out of Baltimore. It came out of an Irish immigrant, Alex Brown. But the great grandson, Benjamin Griswold, donated all the family business records to the Library of Congress. So they are there. So if somebody's ready or nearby, it can actually look at how investment banking was created to support slavery. Those documents are there. So maybe something will do that and dig through. So there's and that'll help us understand who we are as a nation as well. Then you've got to say something. All right, so you do this history, and then are you going to share it or not going to share it? So Lloyd's of London has a really nice website on sharing what their findings were, as does Brown Brothers Harriman. They did a really nice timeline and beautiful sharing of their history. Even a brewery. So this is Green King, and they have now on their website, it's important to acknowledge that after the founding of the brewery, Benjamin went on to own cane sugar plantations in the West Industry, where he enslaved people and used their labor. And it says even that his views on slavery were unpopular, that he actually criticized abolitionists. So they just tell it as part of the story, especially for banks or companies that want to be trusted and build on their heritage. If you want to be trusted, you got to say what you did, and acknowledge that. So then once you say it, you do have to engage with affected parties. These are some of the 90 Holocaust survivors that I met with to talk about what they thought the railway company should do. And it was fascinating to hear. Of course, they don't all agree, right? They have really different ideas about what justice means, what they want to see the company do. Um, but it was beautiful to talk to them and hear their ideas about what justice was, because it also reminds me, like, who am I to decide, right? Like, I didn't live it. I have no idea what the impact was on their lives. So you have to engage with affected parties and descendant communities if you're doing the real atonement work, which is why lawsuits are unfortunate, because lawsuits really divide us. During the lawsuit related to the French Railway, I was able to carry some messages between the survivors and the train company and back, because the lawsuits that went on really kept them separate. And then you develop meaningful responses. The Guardian has 6 areas of restorative justice that they're implementing. They have a whole team that I got to talk to. Super interesting how they're handling their connections to slavery. Yale University too has, like, on their website all the things that they've been doing with their slavery history there. More connected to that one right now because I did a Yale and slavery working group, where I got to kind of talk to the people who've been part of that process. And then you have to reform the corporate ethos. Here's Brown Brother Harriman, who in this moment is still bragging about their diversity, equity, and inclusion programming. And when you go to their history page on their website, they connect their slavery history, a link to this page, saying we're not just about, we had this slavery history, we helped create investment banking that funded plantation agriculture, and here's where our commitments are today. So you have to say who you are today. The idea, some of you might be familiar with Sankofa, which actually I learned at the Harvard Divinity School. There was a great program on restorative justice for racial healing, but it's from the Ghanaian language. And it's this idea of going back and getting it. So it's okay, and there's no shame in going back for something we've forgotten. And in a business-oriented world, of course, it's all about moving forward, right? And not looking back. And so I'm encouraging that actually by helping looking back, it's helping us realize what we're leaving in our wake. What is our legacy? When we look back at the legacy of other people and we address it, we can't help but think about the legacy that we're leaving. And John Braithwaite, who works for restorative justice, corporate accountability, and shaming research, he was saying to me, it would be really great for all ethical training at companies to start with something the company did wrong, to say, we blew it, right? We blew it. We operated, during apartheid. And so now we want to do this instead. It gives you a chance to actually connect that ethics training to something, which really better prepares your employees for today. So if you work at a heritage company and you only read the house history that just glorifies everything, it doesn't prepare you for, like, life as it is and the moral dilemmas that we're going to face today. So there's a lot of benefits for companies for real employee resilience and actual engagement. I mean, young people are wanting to work with companies that they feel aligned with. A lot of them are choosing not to work with certain companies. And some of this push towards corporate reckoning is coming from employees, shareholders too, activists, but also internal people. So you can get a lot more actually brand buy-in from your own stakeholders when you do this work. And this is not just in the past. More recently, we just had Exxon settle for a mass atrocity in Aceh. Chiquita just settled again to pay families who were harmed by FARC in Colombia. So we're seeing settlements, but these are payments. Like, these don't come with apologies because they're lawsuits that lead to settlements. They bury a lot of the data. And there's not atonement of, like, what are you going to do to help those families today other than pay them? And we have some active cases. So maybe some of you saw that several Lafarge executives are now going to prison. A French court ruled for supporting ISIS in Syria. And while I'm, like, delighted that executives are being held accountable, I also wonder what Lafarge is doing to help the legacy of ISIS in Syria. Like, what are they doing for the victims? What are they doing for the country? What they've done is they've changed their name this past week in Nigeria, and they're turning the focus on trying to end malaria in Nigeria, which is great. I'm all for it. But like, what happened in Syria? It's just interesting that news came out right after they were held accountable. And another one to watch, especially those of you who are interested in law or legal experts, London Energy is now being held accountable for war crimes in Sweden, or it's in a lawsuit right now. And that concept that they're working with is reckless intent. Did London Oil demonstrate reckless intent in Sudan? So we're waiting to see how that turns out. And at this moment, I would say atrocity is still just considered by many companies just part of business. How much is it going to cost us? And yes, a few are going to go to jail, but I want to turn our lens to a more restorative lens. Adrienne Lani, who is in Harvard Law, teaches there. I talked to her about this. She teaches restorative justice, and Tyler Genie, who's an expert in the Alien Tort Statute too. This idea of about how we actually go just beyond paying for the harm we've done. So thank you for your attention. You are welcome to reach out to me. I know they're going to share my email. And if you can't find me, I'm sure you can just write Palantir and they know exactly where I am. And I look forward to your questions.
Oh gosh, Sarah, that was wonderful. Hard. It's hard hearing all of this. And at the same time, it's wonderful that someone as intelligent and committed and justice seeker like you is doing this work. So I think, I could speak on behalf of all of us that we're so grateful that you're doing this work. And yeah, thank you. Thank you
Well,
very much, Sarah.
taking volunteers to help.
Yeah, well, I can see plenty of dissertations coming out of your framework too.
Please.
Really. All right, and there's so many wonderful questions. I want to start with my colleague and here at the program on negotiation, Nicole Bryant has this question for you. Sarah, you said that corporations lobby for rights and not obligations. Are there any actors involved in ensuring that corporations' obligations in this regard? Is somebody doing that? Are any international NGOs or individual countries doing a good job holding companies accountable
Yeah.
or advocating rather for that accountability?
Great, Nicole. And yeah, I do talk about examples of that because there are and they matter. One thing that I learned from legal anthropology that I didn't understand before is that actually law follows public will. We like to think that, especially those in the legal field, that like, oh, we make laws and then people follow along. No, 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 no. Where the people are is where the law goes. So it really matters. So in this case that I'm just reading about for the Chinese, those who were enslaved, the Chinese who were enslaved in Japan, Japanese corporations during World War II, there are 300 pro bono lawyers working on the behalf of these thousands, like 20,000 victims. And there's a huge amount of public support, like citizen activists who are pushing for it, pushing for it. So it's a combination. And I think like we're seeing it unsurprisingly more, well, not totally, but more in Europe, we're seeing them, France, hold executives accountable at Lafarge. We're seeing the Swedish courts maybe hold London Oil accountable, which is going to be a big deal. In the United States, we saw two bankruptcy courts refuse to let Johnson and Johnson off the hook for the death of 2 million people related to talc and asbestos because they're trying to declare bankruptcy to get out of that. And even the US Supreme Court didn't let the Sackler family declare bankruptcy for Purdue Pharma and the opioid epidemic. So there are courts. There's the courts that actually didn't let Exxon and Chiquita get away with those that just ruled in those. It's actually the same. I think it's the same judge. He's like just had it. But there are little inklings, and I do say like even the public visibility and naming it. And if you boycott something or divest, you got to write the company and tell them that you're doing it because otherwise they don't know. So it's a combination. Yes, there's lawyers, there's legislators, there is legislation coming. And there's also in the US definitely like a push towards more impunity and more freedom. So,
Okay, thank you. So this is a question from Usman Ahmad, and the question is, what does corporate reckoning look like when the harmed parties are future people, especially in the context of climate change and AI risks? And how should companies reckon with harms that are predictable but not yet fully realized?
Oh, that's great. Oh, Osman, I'm so glad to hear from you. Yes, so in a lot of business ethics, they're discounted. There's like a they're like a the rate of them mattering is discounted. So they are not included. Now, I say if you know you're going to harm them and that's reckless intent, right? So there's a difference between legal accountability and moral responsibility. And saying, okay, we know what we're doing right now is causing harm. So we're going to try to minimize it. So the latest Patagonia annual report does a really good job of this because they work so hard to be both profitable and sustainable, and they admit how hard it is to actually be sustainable. So they acknowledge that they're not and what they're doing to do it. So you want to show that you're working for it. And I think we want to hold each other to account. I mean, and it's future people, but it's even little kids, they're starting to say, like, what are you doing to our planet? We don't have to look too far in the future to realize the impacts.
Right. This is from Charlotte. Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name, Iradapana. And Charlotte wants to know, what are the commonalities and differences between transitional justice and restorative justice?
Yeah, great. So transitional justice, they just emerge from different contexts. Transitional justice is largely about helping countries after mass atrocity, large groups transition. Restorative justice is used in many contexts, but often in schools or maybe in carceral situations where you help an individual understand the harm that they committed, and then those who were harmed by them can understand maybe a backstory of the person who did the harm. So it's a principles about how we engage with one another, rather than just punishing or sending a kid to detention, just actually trying to understand what went on. But there's principles, and it comes out of various traditions, whether it comes from indigenous or the Mennonites, like there's different sort of sources of that. But it's a way of relating, and it's a way of talking about the harm and getting out of just the blame and shame cycle.
Yeah, and it's emphasis on community too, keeping the community together rather than fracturing, right, Sarah?
Yeah.
So Ajit Janjani has this question, which I had this question myself, Ajit. How much atonement is enough? How much time, how much money, the quality strategy, and who decides?
It's such a great question. That's why I kept interviewing these Holocaust survivors, because like, how do you know? And Donna, from your work, what is the world means the world to one this person means nothing to another. They have really different feelings. Like, so one is that reckoning is a process. There, even though I would say, like, of course, it's never done, it's irreparable harm, but there do get to be like when you've done the work well, there is a shift. There is a shift in the relationship between the entity and the harm that is somewhere new. And then you can move. And I saw this with the railway conflict. Like there was a lot of pushing and then it sort of came to an end. And of course, my feeling is that you got to always leave a seat for the past because it will come back, even if you kind of do the work. So there is never enough, but I do think just because um, nothing is perfect, don't make it the enemy of the good, and to just go through the process because you will see a shift if you do it well. Yeah.
And the victims, Sarah, that you interviewed, I was really curious about. It's related to this. What did they feel was the most satisfying response? Wait, what was there a general feeling like that, or did everybody have different ideas?
Definitely different ideas, but I think maybe what you found in your work too is that to see it acknowledged, like for
Yeah.
some people, she said, it wasn't about the check from Germany in her case. It was the letter that came with the check. That's like, we cannot imagine what it's been like. It's like these stories live in you. Like to live your life without your father or live your life without your parents, to never know like who you were going to be even without this atrocity. I mean, your parents are murdered, your community is decimated, you come back, you're poor. Like, they were going to be totally different people had this not happened. So, and they expressed that. So I would say like acknowledging the harm, like saying that you see it, that you know that it can never be enough. Don't make excuses, and help validate it. I mean, in China, it was horrible. The people who worked in the Japanese corporations by force were seen as traitors after the war, because they were stored that way. So to take the shame off of it for them and to give them some recognition seems to matter like more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The acknowledgement is so powerful, so
Yeah.
very powerful. And healing, for healing, especially. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, this is good. This is Morgan Friedman. And Morgan says, Hola, Doctora Fetterman. You should know you have fans of your academic work here in Argentina. And I have a question for you. Do you think there is, or there should be, any sort of statute of limitations for holding companies accountable for atrocities they were involved in? If, for example, General Electric committed atrocities in the 1990s, yes, or 1890s, should the modern GE be held accountable?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I go round and round with this myself because I do want to separate legal liability from moral responsibility and legacy. So if GE did something in the 1890s that caused irreparable harm and maybe we may say like decimated a town. Like they did something, they poisoned a community. Well, okay, like if it's coming up, it's something that needs to be addressed in some way. You're going to address it very differently than if you have somebody who's been harmed. Like there's still some survivors from Chiquita and Exxon's, those cases. So you handle it differently when it's about the past, but you can still address it. Yeah, you can still address it. And like that bourbon company I was talking about, they have some legacies and these are collective harms. I mean, lots of companies and people, and we're all a part of it. So you just have to help with your piece, make your contribution.
Well, I mean, it makes me think about, everybody has some collective responsibility in the companies and so on. Like, how do you break through that resistance, that internal resistance to looking bad in the eyes of the world? Is there some magic
Oh,
way that you can get people to take responsibility and without, I mean, like you said, you talk about shaming and you breaking through that shame of recognizing the impact of your actions on
yeah.
others.
Yeah, especially, well, one, I think it's helpful when it wasn't you individually, right? Like it was your predecessors. They did this thing. We've inherited this thing. And then so not over identifying with that as you, then coming from a place of curiosity, because it's really hard to feel shame and curiosity at the same time,
Yeah.
right? Just get curious. What happened? What was the harm? Get to know the people. Um, and there is some will there is sort of like that immune response of it wasn't me, I didn't do it. So first, actually, the main thing is don't become complicit by burying records, shredding documents, waiting for victims to die. I mean, you're not complicit unless you do certain things. So I make those sort of clear in the book. Like, it wasn't you, but if you start shredding documents, now, okay, it sort of was you. But really moving into, so I really loved working with the Bourbon Company because they were super interested in what we were finding. We're like, whoa, and we weren't there in 1791. Like, none of us were. So, like, what happened? And so like, what did we learn about this origins of the country? And it became sort of that. And then curious about, oh no, how could we support some of the legacy questions? And then have that conversation. So don't over-identify with it, I think, if you weren't there. And it's also, and I don't know how to, I try to share it with my students, get more involved because I got to have a student work with me on bourbon. It's amazing work. It feels so fulfilling in a way that I can't quite explain. There is something that you're sort of healing that does sort of release the past in an interesting way. And so I think people get scared of it, like it's about shame and law and money, but it can really be really, really rewarding work.
It must be. I can only imagine going in there and taking a student with you and having you
Yeah.
both be like investigators. It's a whole new kind of detective work, you know? It's amazing. All right, Monique Parsons wants to know any examples of religious organizations doing a good job in this area?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And I did not mean to leave them out. Some seminaries have been doing some important reckoning work. I mean, we know the Catholic Church has a lot going on about the sex abuse cases. And there's a lot about paying for that, but how to talk about it is still really difficult. But there are seminaries doing work in that area. Um, I'm in San Diego now, so I get to see sort of how the missions tell their stories. Um, and that's been a little bit slower in talking about it. And I actually think this is a very positive moment, at least in the US, to do for the Catholic Church to do some work because they have a pope who's really advancing human rights. So it's a really great time to talk about the past that didn't go well and how we're learning from that and doing better today. Uh, but the nice thing is that all the religions that I studied for this book and looked at, all of them have a path to atonement. They understand that you can't just like throw everybody out for being imperfect. So they actually all have roots and texts that can help us do this work. So actually the religious organizations have a lot more tools, I would say, than people who've just had an MBA in how to do this.
Yeah, that's a good point. Karen Levine wants to know, how do you separate past harms from ongoing harms by way of reconciliation and accountability?
Oh yeah. Can you imagine? I mean, imagine trying to do racial reconciliation work in a community where an AI data center is going up and there being all the environmental racism right now that's happening. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think um, it does create some interesting opportunities. Like, I think it's important to be creative with every company and think about it because let's say, like, you're dealing with legacies of slavery, but there's something happening in that community right now that's like, maybe it's environmental racism or something. Well, help them with that. I mean, the need of the moment and the legacy might be that they don't have power right now. So help them get that power and help them with that work in some way. So I think you can find links. I do think it's important to acknowledge the now. But you definitely want to have these conversations with the affected communities. They won't all agree, but even giving them a chance to argue about it and be in the conversation is important part of the reconciliation because it acknowledges that they are legitimate members of society.
Yeah, thank you. Stuart Moody wants to know if you could specify what kind of volunteers you want and what qualifications are required for which tasks.
That's great. This is my summer project. I'm like, where am I going next? One, I mean, really just an interest in it and like in grappling with these wonderful questions that you've all raised because they're collective questions. It's not for me to answer, and courts will answer them in a particular way, but in particular times. But being engaged, like if there's an organization that you're part of, like, we could explore sort of how you could get that conversation going there. I'd love to work with more organizations who are interested in poking in their past. I did a little bit at our university. I have some things I poke at, which is fun. Yeah, but I mean, just reach out to me and let me know where you're interested. But we're all part of these companies. I mean, all the technology I'm using right now. I try to wear ethical clothing, but like, it's always a degree. Um, and we all have these investments. So I would say like coming at it with that spirit that like we're just trying to do this work together and to address some of the past and make sure that we leave a legacy that's as positive as we can.
Hmm. Wonderful. Um, so Brian Blanche, maybe? Sorry, Brian. What's great that what is no, wait a minute. While it's great that companies that still exist are starting to atone for their past behavior, what about companies that may have benefited indirectly from massacres? For example, the Tulsa Race Massacre and the business that rose up and replaced what was destroyed. Are they approached?
Oh, that is such a great example. I've been thinking about Tulsa and the way that you said it actually framed it in a really, I think a better way than I was even thinking about it. But I think there's just an opportunity, like not thinking about necessarily, because they wiped out, for those who don't know, in Tulsa, they had this like really burgeoning African American middle class, and they were like a strong economy, and they were really actually rising. And then some white supremacists came through and really just flattened Tulsa and ruined it. And so the question is like, what about those companies that come in the aftermath and get all the business and profited from that? So I think there's a real opportunity there to speak to that and hold a space for acknowledging that. So I would actually have those conversations with the community. And again, like, I don't know, is contribution a should? Is contribution like just an opportunity? Like, we're here, we're in Tulsa. I think the last survivor of that massacre just died, or last resident that was there, didn't she just go? But I really think it's a great question to ask. How can we acknowledge that legacy? How can we make sure it never happens again? Or how can we support a community, where it might happen or something. But the question itself is the one I would pose. I would pose it in Tulsa, pose it with the businesses. It's a really lovely question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Kathia Araya wants to know how have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights influenced those efforts on corporate reckoning?
Yeah.
These efforts on corporate reckoning.
Such a good question, and John Ruggie's work in the Global Compact, and I think these UN declarations are important because they make there be an expectation that companies actually contribute to society. We know the UN is like in a real period of sort of transition right now. Those don't have teeth. They're an idea that like we want companies to step up into. I think what I've been reading from people who've worked a lot in that space is how much now we need business leaders to be in those conversations. It's worked out that a lot of people in the UN have been talking to each other and just sharing those same values. But it's like, how do we get the executive who's afraid, like Donna was saying, about like shame or having to pay and not knowing what to do? Like, how do we engage them in these conversations? So I think that community's done a great work of setting standards, but now we've got to like leave our little bubble and go and talk to businesses.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is so big, Sarah. I mean, it's so big I can't see the edges of it. What you have opened up here. I mean, you're going to have to start a whole new company or something to just deal with all of these wonderful examples people are suggesting here. Okay, Dennis Brown wants to know, I learned a new word today, hagiography.
Oh, hagiography, yeah.
Hagiography. Okay. Does that apply to all the parties and not just the perpetrators, but also the victims? Do we seek the truth, the whole truth, or just the current fashionable truth before we move to reckoning and reconciliation? Wow, what a great point.
Oh, what a great, right? Isn't that such a great question? So, yeah, so in that, my husband and I, we did narratives of mass atrocity. We did a little, well, actually, thanks to the Weatherhead, we had a group of scholars come and talk about the stories people tell on the aftermath, sort of these therapeutic histories, we call them, um, that, we either are positioned as totally the victims or totally the heroes, but we all eschew the perpetrator label. So the restorative framework really gives us better language and better tools for having to not put us in victim, hero, perpetrator boxes. And I think that's very helpful because you're right. Like you don't want to fetishize stories either. I mean, a lot of people in mass atrocity, anyone who studied them or lived through one knows people play a lot of different roles. That train company, SNCF, did actually a lot of really important things in World War II. It kept France fed. It helped people visit loved ones. It helped, like, it did lots of important things. There were some resistance in the train company who fought the occupation. So, like, I think it is important to like get away from those frames and to know, yes, that we all can tell therapeutic histories that make us look good. And yeah, and to sort of let the blurry and the complex be there.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the complexity and uncovering the complexity. And I think that's big part of the task is understanding the context, the history, all of these things that you've pointed out. But none of this is simple. There's so many layers and you have done such a beautiful, beautiful job exposing just this massive problem that we have globally. And I mean, I just want to thank you for this remarkable work that you've done and how you've stayed with it. I mean, you're on it, you know. You are so focused, and I appreciate it so much, Sarah. And I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Nicole because she's going to be sharing some of the upcoming events on the program on negotiation. So again, many, many thanks, and I'm turning it over to Nicole here now.
Thank you so much, Donna. And thank you so much, Sarah, for your insightful conversation. Thanks to everybody who was with us today. We had so many questions in the chat. We put Sarah Fetterman's email address there. It's also on the slides when you go back and view the recording so that you can see it. And those of you whose questions we weren't able to ask can follow up with Sarah directly. So thank you so much. And the book, again, Corporate Reckoning. Coming up at the program on negotiation, it is May, which I know in many people's calendars is not yet summer, but it is going into commencement season here at Harvard at the end of the month. We have one more event before we begin our summer series, and that is next week, another Kelman seminar with Tamaris Fakori of Tufts University. Very much looking forward to a conversation with her. And then we are very, very busy doing a lot of teaching at our programs, both in person, on campus at the law school, as well as online. So we look forward to seeing you in whatever capacity. A big thanks to the fabulous PON staff for everything they have done behind the scenes today. We're so grateful for them and all of their work. And we wish all of you well and look forward to seeing you very soon. Thanks again.